Hello, everyone. I'm Saleha, and this is Chai Chat and Community. May is Family and Domestic Abuse Awareness Month, and once again, we are discussing this very, very important subject. Joining me tonight are doctors Manjula O'Connor and Ahona Guha. Thank you for joining me, ladies.
Thank you for having me.
Likewise.
Always a pleasure. I think I'll start with some stats, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
and then I'll ask you to say something about yourself. So, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare describes domestic violence as a type of family violence that occurs specifically between current or former intimate partners. And both family violence and domestic violence include behaviors which are physical violence, which is like hitting, choking, and use of weapons. Emotional abuse, also known as psychological abuse, which is intimidating, humiliating. Coercive control, which is controlling access to finance, monitoring movements, isolating from friends and families. And sexual violence covers sexual behaviors carried out against a person's will. This can occur in the context of family or domestic violence or be perpetrated by other people known to the victim or by strangers. And this is from the ABS 2017. Some stats that I have from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare: 1 in 6 women have experienced physical or sexual violence by a current or previous partner since the age of 15. 1 in 4 women have experienced emotional abuse by a current or previous partner since the age of 15. And 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. Staggering numbers. Manjula?
I think that family violence is a global problem. It's not just an Australian problem. And across the world, roughly similar numbers are showing up. So the rates seem to vary somewhere between 1 in 4 women to 1 in 3 or a bit more than 3 women. And the more worrying part about it is that years of money that's been put into it from governments and the efforts of all the community organizations, the rates don't seem to be changing. If anything, there seems to be a slight increase in sexual assaults. So, today we need to think about why that is happening. Apart from the questions around the nature of domestic violence and what is coercive control, and what do we need to criminalize it to produce better results?
Thank you. Ahonan, will you tell us something about yourself first, please?
Sure. My name is Ahona. I am a clinical and forensic psychologist here in Melbourne, Australia. Most people instinctively know what a clinical psychologist is, but it might be helpful for me to explain what a forensic psych is. Is that right, Saleha? So basically, when we talk about forensic psychology, we are talking about any time the mental health system meets the legal system. So broadly speaking, I work within the space where offenders offend or engage in problematic behaviors that do harm other people for a range of psychological reasons. This could sometimes include mental health reasons, but is certainly not always the case. I work in two different roles. One of my first roles is within the space of private practice, where I do a lot of work with victims of trauma, including family violence. My second and probably bigger role is within the field of public forensic mental health, where I assess and treat perpetrators who do engage in a range of problem behaviors, including family violence. So broadly speaking, that's where I sit. I have experience with both victims and perpetrators. And in my pre-psychology days, I also worked as a case manager with a family violence organization in the Far East Melbourne. Yeah. Did
Thank
you
you.
have, yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, Manjula's talked about the data, and
Hmm.
because you also work with perpetrators, Ahana, why do you think people engage in family violence?
Look, there's a range of reasons. I was thinking about that a little bit before I came on the show, just to articulate my thoughts a little bit better. I think that that there are factors at sort of a range of levels that do mean that people engage in this form of behavior. So if you're looking broadly speaking, initially societally, we are talking about things like gender norms and power and control, that are very common within the South Asian community. Some of that is patriarchal power and control, but I think it's very important to also notice that power and control can exist within certain members of the families. Often, I think, within the realms of the mother-in-law and father-in-law relationship, there is anecdotally, I think, a certain amount of family violence that does exist within that space that's not directly governed by patriarchal um, or very overtly gender-based norms. So broadly speaking, anytime anyone has a lot of power over someone else, we see possibly increased risk in family violence. Apart from those, we're talking about the more intra-individual factors. So we look at things like how a person responds to provocation, whether they perceive hostility, whether they're able to manage anger, what they're like when they do become distressed, whether they're able to communicate assertively instead of becoming aggressive, whether they're able to inhibit action, so when they are angry, whether they are able to stop themselves, whether there's any mental health issues, whether there's any substance use, because that's a very, very big factor that we do see in cases where there is physical violence. Personality disorders are also a common one we look out for. So people will either have full-blown personality disorders occasionally, but more often certain traits of personality disorders that might mean that they feel entitled to harm someone else. Situationally, we're sort of looking at variables where there's high conflict within certain intimate relationships that might create a context where there could be violence. We are looking at things like stress. We do anecdotally know, and also I think the data shows that there is a lot more family violence when there's high stress and poverty, simply because people struggle to manage those contexts. So yes, so a large range of reasons. Really hard to pin down one, but I think
Yeah.
it's important
Manjula?
to.
Yep. So, Saleha, I think it's very, very important to make clear what is the most important factor. Okay. And then there are other factors that facilitate domestic violence, but there is one factor that is absolutely the key to domestic violence is power difference and abuse of power. And so we must never ever forget that when there is a power difference between two people in a relationship where one has more power, it's more power in decision making, more power over money, it may be power over, her residency status, those kind of things leave a lot of options open for abuse if there are people who are inclined to be like that. And uh, of course, the power abuse can be facilitated by lack of self control, right? So there are people who can control themselves better. So, but there are people who they lack that self control. Especially if they take drugs or they are drinking or they are mentally ill. But those are called facilitatory factors. They are not the key factors.
Feedback.
And this is the point that everyone who is a victim or a perpetrator or people who are bystanders need to understand that it is the abuse of power in many different ways that a perpetrator is able to victimize their victim.
Are people realizing it? We've been talking, you and I, this is our third chat on this subject, and I know you have talked about it at length at networking events where women have been there. Are women realizing it, Manjula? Are they coming forward?
So I think the women are starting to realize that this is something that is not quite right, although they may not be able to call it domestic violence. When you are at the hands, suffering at the hands of a autocratic dictator, you know it's not correct. Okay, you know it's wrong, but how many people actually call it domestic violence? And therefore they don't. If you don't name it, you don't know where to go get help. And so it's so we try to create awareness around what actually is domestic violence and where what are the tools you can use to get help. And for people who might be using domestic violence, what are the things that you need to think about? One of the things that I recently wrote about in our newsletter was self confidence.
Yes, I
That
remember you talking about it too.
Yeah, that's right. You were there at the International Women's Day when I spoke about it, but I wrote about it in detail in our newsletter. And one of the things that I believe is that if you are a genuinely self confident person, genuine, and you feel quite comfortable within your skin and within yourself, you would not need to perpetrate violence against anyone to feel that power, because you within you are okay and you feel like you don't need to exert power to have that, feel that confidence about your own self. And so this is the thing that I hope that men and women can learn, and we trying to increase that awareness. Um, and so now we have put in a funding. We've been doing awareness work with case-based studies for a long time, and we've got more funding this year to do that. Another year, I think we've done it for nearly 6 years, so we got another year now. But the more interesting thing that we are doing now is we put in funding for theater. So, community participatory theater, where people will come together as a community and bring stories and that they've heard of around types of abuse that can occur, and how we can portray that in a theater form, in an acting form, which the community members can then comment on to say, this
Yes.
seems right, this seems not right. And so then to learn about what is the impact it's having and what we can do about it. So we are hoping we will get the money for it, because it's a very expensive project. And the government, Victorian government, is, I'm hoping, looking at it favorably at this point. We will know in a month.
Okay. All the best.
Thank you.
Uh, so, Hannah, your area of specialty is intimate partner violence. What exactly
Yeah.
is it? And what are the signs? I mean, how do women know that
Yeah.
that is a
So
violation of their right?
look, when we talk about intimate partner violence, I am basically talking about what you were talking about, Manjula, which is domestic violence. I personally prefer not to use the term domestic violence because it tends to decriminalize the issue. It sort of puts it back into the realms of the family, whereas really, when we are talking about partner violence, we are talking about a form of violence and we are talking about a crime. Within the forensic psychology world, we do a lot of risk assessments, and different types of violent behaviors have different factors that lead to it, which is why we tend to break down family violence, broadly speaking, into things like child to parent violence. So I've worked with a lot of younger people who do abuse parents, parent child violence, as well as intimate partner violence. So these are the three specialties. I suppose elder abuse would be another part of it, but that's not really a realm that I work in. So look, when I talk about intimate partner violence, I am very specifically talking about partner violence, whether that is emotional abuse or physical abuse as well as sexual, that does occur within the realms of an intimate partner relationship where two people are within a relationship. I think that sort of when it happens outside the bounds of a intimate relationship. So when, say, two people have intimate relationship and we have a person continuing to pursue someone else, from a pure forensic psychological perspective, we would actually call that stalking. Um, so that's also part of the work that we do. We assess and treat a lot of stalkers within my role. Yeah. Did you have any other
Yeah,
questions?
stalking is something I wanted to ask you about, but I'll ask about it later. Yeah,
Yeah.
the stalking
So,
part of it is something that I did not know. I mean,
and I think
yeah,
that's I
honestly.
think that's important to draw a distinction between the behaviors, because we know that there are a lot of risk markers for stalking. We have a lot of research tools that have excellent validity. And when I say validity, I mean that they've been tested to actually measure um, measure what they say they do. So we are able to actually identify perpetrators. So I don't know if people are aware of the cases of Kelly Wilkinson and John Edwards. So both of those would be considered cases of stalking, because in this instance, the former intimate partner pursued the woman outside the bounds of the relationship. And while I obviously haven't done a formal risk assessment for either of these cases, just looking at some of the behaviors demonstrated, I can tell that they would both be considered high risk, and they ideally would have been picked up on as needing a certain intervention. So yeah, there's definitely a crossover with stalking as well as intimate partner violence. Yep.
So, Celia, I might just talk a little bit about
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
coercive control.
Yes, which is what I was going to ask you about coercive control. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't
So,
think people understand what exactly coercive control is.
yeah,
So if you could explain that a bit more in detail,
yeah,
because physical, I mean, family abuse is not always just physical, right? There are many, many ways, and coercive control is one of them. And if you can talk about that.
yeah. So, people talk about physical violence and emotional violence and financial abuse and sexual abuse. So, what coercive control is? It is looking at all of those things put together, but woven with the thread of intimidation, threat, isolation. So, if you can imagine a victim who is continuously being intimidated and threatened and controlled to do exactly what the perpetrator wants her to do. So she can't go to work or she can go to work. She can wear her clothes or she can't wear certain clothes. She can talk to people or she can't. Can she go out of the house? No, or she can't. Or whether she has money, whether she can go shopping, whether she will talk to friends next door, and being watched while she is observing doing all of that stuff. So imagine being in a house, being observed, being told what to do, being say what to say, and then being criticized, humiliated, and degraded if and whenever the perpetrator feels like it. Imagine that happening over the years, years after year, month after month. And then there is the threat, if she doesn't follow, there are the threats of deportation, withdrawal of sponsorship, of threat of violence, threat of sexual violence. So the victim is in a constant state of fear, and constant state of feeling threatened that she's going to be beaten anytime, because that threat is real threat, like it can actually materialize. And so the coercive control is ongoing, whereas physical violence is episodic. So the when the domestic violence, when the partner violence laws are applied, they usually look at episodes of physical violence. They don't look at ongoing emotional abuse of isolation, control, threats, intimidation. And what the result is that most of the times domestic violence doesn't get properly recognized, and the result is that if the perpetrator rings the police first and says, she's hitting me, um,
You mean they do it?
the do- 12% of victims are misidentified as perpetrators. And I have, at this moment, at least 8 women who have been uh, victims of coercive control over the years been called perpetrators, and who have been handcuffed and taken to jail, taken to police custody overnight, and released the next day with bail. Their children taken away from them. This is happening now in Victoria, in Australia. And in actual fact, um, now I can't remember which of the woman it was. She was labeled a perpetrator and then she got killed. I
Wow.
think I think it might have been the latest one. The
Was it John Edwards' wife, or are you thinking about
I
oh
think
his ex-wife? Sorry, because I know that within the family court domain, she was there were concerns that he raised about her capacity, and she had to go through quite a protracted
yes,
legal battle
yes,
to get the
yeah,
kids. But
yeah. I
yeah,
think it might have been that case
yeah,
where he ended up killing the 2 children,
yeah. That was the
and
John.
then himself, and
And that
then
family courts and the family court system is a disaster.
yeah, and then
Yeah,
he ended up killing the kids. Then
yeah.
he killed himself, and what life would she left have left? So she killed herself.
She did
Oh
kill
my
herself
God.
later.
So
Yeah.
this was about last year.
Yeah, and it's been in the news recently because I think because of the coroner's report inquest.
And I think that is correct that he went to the court and said she's a perpetrator, or went to police.
It's not uncommon, I see that happening within the realms of the family court as well. So basically, so typically people will go to family court once they have separated. Not uncommon for people to make allegations at that point in time to say that someone's an unfit mother. And I think there have been certain cases where, yep, the family courts have been very, very biased and have put people at great risk. So that's part of the work that needs to be done within the space as well, because it's really important to keep people safe, to keep women and children safe. But if the court systems are not playing that out within the different areas, then that's obviously going to put people back in um, very difficult situations where they do sometimes have to interact with the perpetrators or have to drop kids off to see someone who is harming them. Certainly seen some of those cases. So there's work that needs to be done within the family court space. I think magistrates courts are getting much better at now recognizing when there is family violence and granting intervention orders, and also charging people when they breach, because intervention orders by themselves are just a civil document. You can't put someone in jail for that. They have to actually breach the intervention order before you can charge them. So that's part of what you're talking about with coercive control, Manjula. They're trying to criminalize that so that they can actually charge people with these offenses instead of just saying you're being you're being isolated and controlled. We're just going to serve an intervention order, because that doesn't have a lot of power at the moment.
Yep. So what we are saying is that if the law would recognize coercive control, name it and criminalize it, then there will be less of a chance of the women being
Yeah,
misidentified as perpetrators, because the police would look at the history over the years, and they can look at the SMS messages, and they can look at the threatening phone calls and emails and any other tracking devices that the perpetrator might have put on that person's phone. Then that means that the true picture of domestic violence starts to emerge,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Because
because the fact is that in a home where we should be safe, that
mm,
is where women are most unsafe.
Yes.
And the coercive control goes on. Now the coercive control also includes jealousy, as a result of jealousy, people, perpetrators, will feel extremely insecure in themselves, but take it out on the victim and controlling them, and suspecting every interaction they might have with with
Opposite sex.
with a person of the opposite sex, um, about her co-workers, about people she might be dealing with as clients. And I just saw a woman the other day. Uh, she's a waitress in a restaurant, and uh, the husband feels jealous when she goes to work at the restaurant because she's going to talk to men who she is going to wait on. Now,
I think, yeah.
this is exactly what needs to be taken into account when people when police are coming to people's homes and asking them about uh, describing domestic violence story to them.
I think that that's a really important point because one of the principles that we do work with when we are looking at stalking as well as family violence is not just looking for the one episode, we're looking for a pattern of behavior. Difficult to do again because the police may not carry the same knowledge that mental health professionals do. But when we are talking about female violence, and I suspect that this is what's happening when certain women are being mislabeled perpetrators, that there's probably been this long-standing pattern of intimidation and violence, and what you're calling coercive control, and then someone may react impulsively, angrily, because it's hard to be in that situation, and they may lash out, but the police may be being called by the perpetrator for that one incident, will then look just at the incident and possibly label the woman the perpetrator without sort of considering this long-standing pattern of behavior and the actual reason why maybe she may have reacted with anger.
Yeah,
Um, and I think, yeah, very important from a policing perspective. I know there's a lot of argument at the moment that family violence shouldn't sit within the policing space. I very strongly disagree with that because it is fundamentally a
So
crime.
where would it sit?
Well, I read a couple of pieces recently saying that it should sit within the health and the welfare space. And I do agree that some of the determinants of family violence sit within the health and welfare space, but fundamentally we cannot decriminalize something that is a crime. And I want to say that this is a very niche view. It's certainly not the mainstream view. I think we need to be treating family violence with as much respect and as much regard as we treat other crimes. We would never say to someone else who say goes up and hits strangers in the streets that okay, this is a thing that sits within the health and welfare space. So we do need we need a coordinated police response. We need a lot of support services for the victims, and I think we also need some really good treatment for perpetrators, which I suspect is where a lot of the family violence response is falling down at the moment.
I'm going to
yeah,
show some comments that are coming through. Hi, Chris. And from Sreyoshi, who's watching from New Delhi. Hello, Sreyoshi. Um, I don't know, Manjula, did I tell you about a networking event I went to, I think last month? And it was a women's only networking event. And amongst other things that were talked about, this lady came and sat next to me, and she said she started this sisterhood WhatsApp group because her husband's a builder and he has a lot of um, Indian men working with him, and they go back, and there's a lot of family violence. And the reason, and I asked her why, because she says she's been trying to talk to, the men, her husband's been trying to talk to the men, and their excuse is the wives go out and have affairs. And I said, how do you know? They don't know. They think. So I'm
So
guessing it's similar to what
yeah,
Manjula's saying.
yeah.
She's a waitress. She'll be talking to
Mm.
customers who are walking in. So
Also, even if someone is having an affair, and I absolutely believe you when you say that that's not happening, you cannot abuse and hit someone else. It is assault. If there's any message I want to get out there, it is that you cannot hurt someone else, regardless of the reason.
Yes, I
Yep, I
agree.
think there are two parts to it. Yes, so if you feel jealous, the question and it causes, if you really are feeling jealous, it causes a lot of distress to that human being, um, and that person, if that person is a mature human being, they will take responsibility for their distress and learn, go get therapy and learn to manage that distress. Because when you are distressed, it's not reasonable to take your distress out on another person by accusing them or by hitting them or by abusing them. That is what a child does. That is what a 3-year-old child does when they are distressed. When you grow up as an adult human being, if you are distressed, you try and understand what you're distressed. You say to yourself, I'm feeling distressed. What is it about?
Mm.
You go outside the door of your home, go for a walk, identify it is causing pain, go speak to your GP and go and get some counseling sessions. It is not rocket science, but seems to
Yeah,
be so difficult for people.
yeah.
You
So,
know, it is
mm,
so important for people to learn to understand their own mind. If only people will spend time on trying to understand themselves, we wouldn't have so
yeah,
many problems in this world.
agreed. Yeah. So you basically summed up some of the treatment that we do with
And I
perpetrators
was
there.
going to
Because,
ask you that,
yeah,
yes, because you work with perpetrators.
yeah. So we have two arms of our practice. We assess risk, so to see if there's risk of physical violence, but also risk whether the behaviors are going to happen again. And we also treat people who are at higher risk of engaging in those behaviors again. Very much aligned with what Manjula said there. So really helping people understand what their behaviors are, because often people come into me. This is without a doubt the majority of people. I'd say I want to say 100%, but there may be a couple I'm forgetting who will say to me that it wasn't my fault. She made me do it. Um, or I didn't do it, or it wasn't as bad as the police make it out to be, or that my lawyer told me to plead guilty. That's a very common one I hear. Largely speaking,
Wow.
yep. That's a really, really common one I hear within the fields of intimate partner violence, sex offending, and stalking, possibly because there's a lot of shame around these types of offending. So the task for us then is to try and break that down, to try and help the person understand what the attitudes and beliefs are, why they feel like they might be entitled to engage in some of these behaviors, the costs for them, sometimes the cost for other people, though that doesn't work sometimes if people harbor a lot of anger towards the victim because they might just be happy that they've actually made the victim suffer. So I sort of work with the empathy question carefully, helping them, work on basic skills like anger management, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, which is what you do when you're very angry, assertive communication, problem solving, consequential thinking. So if I do this, what is going to happen? Those are some of the basic treatment targets that we work with, because at its basic, I would say some of these issues around intimate partner violence and stalking are because people cannot contain their own impulses, their own distress. They have a range of views and beliefs that make them feel like they're allowed to inflict violence on other people, or that they have power over people and that they can act in this way. And it's really about breaking down those beliefs and then breaking down the behaviors that sit under the beliefs, and also helping people form other ways of dealing with some of these difficulties. So that's the work that we do.
Anna, what's been the success rate?
Really hard to say. I went away and did a little bit of reading after you asked me the question during our prep chat last week. I would have to sum up the broader rates of treatment within the intimate partner violence field as being a little sometimes, but not a great effect. With the program that I specifically work for, we have evaluated that, but unfortunately, we didn't separate out the behavior, so I can't tell you whether what the rates were for family violence, because we also deal with a range of other offending programs. But at this point in time, within the field, broadly speaking, not a lot we are doing has a lot of effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Manjula,
Okay.
have you had women come back to you saying that, their partners have changed?
Um, maybe one or two, but I
Wow.
also do, yeah, maybe I also do see uh, perpetrators, men who have used violence, and I have to say that men who are a bit older and more mature, it's easier to work with them than younger men. And there are sometimes I've had very uh, powerful discussions with men about our culture and about uh, the use of power that is so unconscious, and how it uh, manifests itself in the family, and how they are not aware of its impact on the other person
Good.
at all.
Is it generational? Is it something that they have gotten used to seeing their parents do it or their grandparents do it? So they think it's like very normal? Is that what it is?
Of course it is. It definitely learned. And I mean, it's not just parents, grandparents. It's been like that for millions of years, right? And it's not new, and therefore, but when parents, fathers of sons and mothers of sons are more carefully, bring up the children more carefully with empathy training and with a distress tolerance, then and at the same time giving them, real love and real emotional connection, it is possible for boys to grow up into
Yep.
more sensitive, more empathic, and more aware of the impact of their behavior on their partner. It is very possible.
Yep.
And so now, when I said it's easier for me to work with older men, I meant men who are in their 40s or 50s. But uh, they need to be open minded about it. And what opens their mind, nothing opens their mind more to therapy and learning about themselves and learning about the culture, is if they have a threat of a court sentence. That is what motivates a lot of people. And but it's they there has been, I have seen a little bit of shift in some men, and it can be
You would like
quite
to
good.
say more? You,
um you're talking to me?
yeah, I said you'd like to see more,
I
obviously.
would like to see more, a little bit more change. I'd like to see a bit more uh, men to become a bit more open minded about what power actually means, and about what empathy and compassion actually means. That when you come home from work, at the end of the day, you're tired, you put your feet up and you say to your wife, bring me a glass of water. Well, she just got home 10 minutes before you.
Yep.
And she is exhausted as well from working, but everybody's tired. Okay, we're all tired. Like, this is part of living in Western society where there is no
Absolutely.
servants.
Yep.
And we're all exhausted after we come from work. And it's if I sit down and I say to my partner, can you get me a glass of water whilst I just recover from my days? He would say, oh, look, I'm tired too.
Yep.
So, and so therefore I would much rather get up, get myself a glass of water, and whilst I'm up, or just get him a glass of water as well, you know. But that's the kind of attitude that we all need to have, is a little bit of care and compassion towards our partners in life who are essentially very important people to us.
And I think
And
towards other
today's
people as
Mother's
well.
Day, so I would hope this message is going through to
Mm.
people.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, you have a very important point there, because that's how kids learn. So when we think about how kids learn, it's not informal classes at school. And when I'm talking about things like relationships, it isn't seeing how respectful relationships play out within the home and how people model behaviors toward each other. So you are talking about those micro behaviors on a daily basis that are very important.
Yeah, it manifests itself in micro behaviors. That is the point about it.
Yeah.
That is how the respect comes up.
Can you explain micro behaviors for our viewers?
Well, I
So
think we just made that term up, but really, when we are talking about smaller instances of behavior, so when we talk about something, and there's been a lot of talk about respectful relationships and consent recently within the Australian media because of a few higher profile cases, but when I'm so breaking that down, it's difficult to think about what consent looks like. So that's sort of the broader arching behavior. But to break that down to a micro behavior, for instance, it would be saying to a child, "Are you happy to give me a hug?" Or asking a friend, "Are you happy for me to post this picture of you online?" So those are the smaller ways in which these broader behavioral components can be broken down. So when I'm working with someone on things like respect or consent, I always break it down, because it's very difficult to grasp at an overarching level what a person means by being respectful. But if I could say, well, do you say please? Do you say thank you? Do you think about this other person? Do you look at their phone? Those are easier things for people to grasp. Yeah.
yeah, so in the context of a family, it might be that, money management. So money goes into a joint account. Uh, does do the two people talk to each other before they spend money, or if one person spends money on a cup of coffee, does the other person criticize her for having
Question.
a coffee?
Yes.
Yeah.
uh, or the one person feels free to remove $500, $1,000 to send it to his family back in India without checking, then that is not right. And I mean, the same for her. She cannot send money back to her family without checking. Or the other thing might be like, if friends are coming at home, how do you talk to her? Or how do you help her in cooking? Or do you sit down and you say, my friends are coming, you cook the dinner, I'll sit down and drink whiskey with them. And so, these are all disrespectful behaviors that need to be understood, and know that these things are not only having an effect on the partner, it's having an effect on the children. They are watching this
Yes.
behavior. That's what they will do.
Yep.
So, like one woman told me, if she served a plate of food, a platter of food to people, he would criticize the way she was carrying the platter of food, or the way she served it, or he would say, "Careful, you'll not careful." Some abusive word and say, "You will break it," and next thing, and she's shivering in her boots, and next thing she did break it. It
He
slipped
dropped
out of
it.
her finger.
Yes.
Now that is coercive control, and that is lack of respect, and that is a constant state of anxiety and fear in the victim's mind. And the worst part about all of it, Celia, is that when the police come, right, and when the perpetrators are taken away and they are charged with domestic violence offenses, intervention order or assault, or whatever else it might be, uh, and the perpetrators are removed from their home. Imagine, you once one day you are in charge, you think you are the king of the family, and next day you are being thrown out of your home by the police. How horrible that is. And we should try, everyone, all of us should try and prevent that from happening, because we want to be in our homes, we want to be happy, and we want to know that our partners and our families are the most important thing to us in
Absolutely.
life. We must value that, and we must take care of each other so the family is maintained.
And I want to ask you about stalking. Tell us about
Mm.
stalking.
Stalking within the Victorian legislation is basically defined as a series of repeated unwanted intrusions into a person's life that may be expected to cause a reasonable person fear. This could be anything from sending a series of text messages after a person said, "Look, I don't want to talk to you anymore," to turning up at someone's house is a very common
Is this
one.
after separation or is this after a
No,
relationship breakdown?
from a forensic psychological perspective, we would classify it family violence if it happens while a relationship is happening, and we would look at it as stalking once a relationship's ended. But things like GPS tracking as well is a common thing that we're seeing, and that's
I'm
often used.
sorry, GPS tracking.
GPS tracking is a yeah, so it's basically when people will use someone's phone to check where they are in more extreme cases. And I saw this a fair bit when I worked as a case manager within the field of family violence. People would actually stick trackers on other people's cars. So it felt like the perpetrator. So I'd have clients coming to me going, "Look, I think he knows where I am," and we would then have to take the car down to the police station, and they would scan the car and work out that there was actually a GPS tracker stuck under the car. So someone
Oh my
always knew where
God.
a person was. And that was often in cases like you were talking about, Manjula, where there was extreme jealousy, or what we might call morbid jealousy, where a person is fixated on this thought that someone else is having affairs. A very, very high risk factor for violence in stalking, by the way, this sense of morbid jealousy. So yeah, so stalking could be, relatively innocent but problematic still in terms of the psychological harm caused to victims, where people get thousands of text messages over the course of days. But it could also include violent behavior. Sometimes could involve what we call approach behaviors, so approaching someone's house, sending their stuff in the post. So a range of behaviors, but the crux is pattern of behavior over a few days at least, and you know definitely unwanted behavior. So it's not stalking if both people are within a relationship. There has to be a clear sign that the relationship's ended.
Thank you.
So there's often a crossover, yeah, as you can imagine, between family values and stalking.
Wow. I'm amazed every time I listen to these stories.
Okay.
Manjula, do you
Yeah.
remember last year when you and me had this conversation on family violence? You told me after the show that 7 women had killed themselves and
Yeah.
how upset you were.
Yes.
Why are
Yeah.
women still not coming out and talking? Why are they
Yeah.
not doing it? Why are they quiet and why are they taking it? So, this is for all women who are citizens, who are permanent residents, who are on, whatever visa, who's a student. Why are they not coming out and talking?
Yeah. So one of the big problems is societal pressure to stay married. That in our culture, it's so important for women to be not seen to be divorced or single or separated. And for that reason, women would rather have the honor of being married uh, than being free of violence. And the honor is actually dishonor of being married if there is coercive control. It's usually the coercive controlling behavior that goes on for years, because that is what is harder to, um, sometimes harder to identify, but also harder to do something about, because it's low grade violence. Whereas if somebody broken someone's bones, next thing, definitely the police will be called, and next thing they will definitely, the perpetrator will be pulled out of their home and given an intervention order. They can't go near the victim. But if they are simply abusing, degrading, humiliating, criticizing, putting the woman down, threats of beating or threats of smashing the phones or threat of throwing things around, that may not, she may not identify that as domestic violence, whereas it is domestic violence. And the police, many of them will recognize it as domestic violence as well. So the point is that if you feel fear, think about it. If you feel fear in your own home of any person, it is important to talk to your doctor about it, because access to services is through your GP, or you can ring directly 1800 Respect
Yeah, I've got all the numbers at the ticker. Yes.
and talk to someone online.
Mm.
And you can talk to them confidentially, and they will respond to you and give you the absolutely the right help that you may that will be suited for your circumstances. They will never ask you to leave if you don't want to leave, but
Yep.
they will be there for you in ways that is important. But then also make sure when you can visit your GP and get to a counselor or get to see the right kind of a therapist to get the help you need, because that could save your life, and that will be so important for your children. And it makes, that is what may keep the marriage intact, rather than sitting there suffering and becoming depressed. The common things that coercive control does to people is that the women get anxiety, panic attacks, sleeplessness, depressive illness, and when they recover, they never easily recover from these relationships. They have ongoing post traumatic stress disorder with flashbacks. So, it's not good for anyone in our homes, in our society, in our country, in the world, to have this kind of thing going on.
And
I think,
yet it doesn't stop.
yeah, I think there's often a sense of learned helplessness as well that I see in my work with victims of family violence, where occasionally people struggle to see that it's happening, and that's often when it's subtle um, forms of behavior. But other times, people are so used to the behavior that they feel like they can't do anything about it. And I think that's often when societal pressure to stay within the relationship will play a big factor in that, a sense of not being able to access services and not really knowing what's out there. And I think that's why it's great you put those numbers down there. So 1-800 Respect will actually connect people with all of their local family violence services, one for each region of Victoria. Yeah. So
Yeah, and also, don't ever think money is going to be a problem. Government has got a lot of packages, economical packages available for women, even women on temporary visas, women on student visas, women who have, do not have permanent residency. We have worked very hard with the government to make sure that these women get Medicare, they get their accommodation, they get their finances. So don't let that stop you from going and getting help from 1800 Respect. So it's better to, I'm sure your parents, their parents would rather see them alive than trapped in an abusive marriage.
Well,
Yeah,
even at Indian Care, we can refer people to the, the respective services. You know that, Manjula. Yes. So,
yeah,
um, anyway,
absolutely. Then, and, in my consulting room, I see parents come from India to support their daughters. I end up treating their parents as well. They are all suffering from so much severe depression, anxiety, sleeplessness, just like the victims are. And they all end up requiring antidepressants. They all are undernourished, and they're all anemic, and they're all fainting because they haven't eaten properly. They don't haven't drunk enough fluids, and there have been another form of coercive control. The women are deprived of food. Women are not given enough to eat.
Women are deprived of food. Oh my God. What lengths are we going to go to?
Yeah, and not allowed to leave the house, and yet there is not enough food being brought into the house. It almost a prison-like situation we are talking about.
I think sometimes when I feel I cannot be shocked anymore, it's thank you very much for joining me tonight. I hope this brings some hope to women who are looking for some ways to report, get out, have a better life. We don't want marriages breaking, but we don't want women to go to violence either.
No, yeah, absolutely right.
Thank you again. Have a
Thank you.
good night. Stay safe.